Hello everyone, my name is Howell and I like talking about building and sailing boats. This video shows my build of a 4.6 meter sail and oar dinghy, the Minahouet, designed in France by Francois Vivier. I bought the kit of CNC cut parts from Jordan Boats in October 2021 and finished it in May 2023, just in time to take part in the Semaine du Golfe, the traditional boat regatta held every 2 years in the Gulf of Morbihan, Brittany. The kit arrived in 3 large boxes. All the parts had been separated from the 8x4 ply sheets that the CNC cutter uses. This probably saved me a couple of days' work. There were, however, the remnants of the tabs to be sanded off. Construction of the boat involves a number of mortise and tenon joints, and as the cutter can only cut curves, the mortise holes and tenons have to be squared to fit. After marking them square, I used a triangular file to remove the excess wood. As I was finishing a Sailway Fisher Skylark dinghy that I'd started in 1998, I couldn't set up the Minahouet jig, so in between jobs on the Skylark I started epoxy coating various Minahouet parts. This would lead to a couple of problems later. I then started putting together the centerboard case. Each side of the case is made up of 2 9mm sheets glued together. The outer side shown here has 5 slots to allow different positions for the footrest for rowing. The inner side has a slot along which the centerboard pivot pin can travel so that the board can be removed like a dagger board. On the outside is glued a strip to support the flooring, and on the inside are the front and back end pieces. Once the Skylark was finished, I was able to set up the building jig. I wanted it to be at a suitable working height and to be movable. Having to work with standard length woodstock meant it had a 2.4 meter base. In hindsight, I should have sourced longer timber to extend to the transom and, more importantly, the stem. Here can be seen a trial fit of the frames and the stem on the jig. The lighter non-epoxied frames are there to help support the hull strakes and do not form part of the hull. The inner stem shown here was made up from 3 pieces glued together, and some pre-beveling is done before attaching to the front frame. The jig side pieces end at that frame with a short central piece for the stem. This turned out to be inadequate and allowed the stem to twist, and a much sturdier support should be fitted. The 2 round holes are for access to a storage compartment with the front section a buoyancy tank. Under French regulations, this has to be filled with foam, and despite it being otherwise sealed, there were 2 limber drainage holes in the front frame. Were these to allow air to escape in hot climates? As I didn't intend using foam, I couldn't see the point of the holes, so blocked them off and put in an inspection hatch instead, just in case hot air expansion ever became a problem. As both the centerboard case and the mast box have to be fitted to the structural frames, these have to be finished first. Here are the side pieces of the box with 2 rails in place on which the mast step plate rests. This shows a dry fit of the complete box and then in position between the 2 front frames. It has a limber hole matching one in the frame, as it is of course open at the top. I'd also finished the hatch covers. These have an inner bar which keys with a slotted ring on the inside of the frame. I did this out of the build guide sequence, as it would have been very difficult aligning them once the frame was in place. Here the centerboard case is fastened between frames 3 and 5. On the inner faces of the frames are added doublers, which act as supports for the side tanks. Here's the centerboard, partly shaped fore and aft, also the tiller template, and then the 3 sapele blanks, which will be shaped to make up the tiller. I then started on the sole. With 8 foot by 4 foot ply sheets, longer parts have to be joined. Kit manufacturers can allow for traditional scarf joints or cut the finger scarf joints that I had. This did lead to an alignment problem, which I'll cover later, but with the sole, the joint could be set up accurately. Pre-beveling could be done before the 2 halves were joined and fitted. Here the sole has been beveled, joined together, and then glued to the transom, rear frame, frames 3 and 5, the centerboard case, the front 2 frames and mast box, and finally the stem. It is also screwed in place at the stem, centerboard side rails, and the transom. One issue I had was the sole transom joint, and I reinforced it with a knee support. Unfortunately, this was slightly too thick, which later led to a problem with the rudder pintle bolts. A slimmer knee was needed. The transom is made up from 2 pieces, with a shallower doubler piece at the top with a rail across, leaving a gap for the rear deck to fit between. The rudder stock is built up from a number of parts. 2 centerpieces are glued to one cheek, and the other is bolted on with a central wood pivot for the blade. 3 tiller pieces are glued together with a mortise to fit over the top tenon on the rudder stock. A brass pin acts as a pivot to enable the tiller to lift up and off. As with the sole, the 2 halves of each strake could be beveled before joining. However, when it came to joining the 2 halves for the first strake, the garboard, a problem arose. The finger joints appeared to be a tight fit, but with one half firmly anchored, the end of the other half could be moved in a 30mm arc. So, what was the correct position, as the curvature of the strake was obviously critical? In the end, I spoke to Alec Jordan of Jordan Boats. He told me that the cut files from Francois Vivier gave a certain tolerance on the joint, and he had actually reduced this. To solve the problem, he very kindly sent me a full-size printout of a section of the plans on an A1 size sheet showing the finger joints. I was then able to accurately line up each strake half panel over the plan and glue accurately. Each joined strake was nearly 5 meters long, so having a long work surface was important. However, even with a flat base at the joint and very firm clamping, some of the joints came out less than perfect, with fingers proud or depressed and having to be sanded down or filled. A wider clamp down plate should have been used. I had earlier done a dry fit of the garboard. I made up some L-shaped supports to rest the strakes on, these being held in place by clamps, one-handed ones being easiest. One issue arose here due to me having epoxied the frames. First, as each frame and the transom have to be beveled to accommodate the lie of the strake to the curve of the hull, it was much harder to work with the epoxy hardened ply, and it would have been better if I had left the edges bare. Secondly, on each frame edge there was a small 1mm hole on one face to mark the starting position for the bottom edge of each strake. With the strake aligned on these marks, the top edge should overlap the preceding one by the width of the bevel, 22mm. In epoxying the frames, I hadn't noticed these and largely covered them up, making them difficult to see. I'd also glued the tank support doublers for frames 3 and 5 on the side of the holes for a couple of the strakes. Thankfully, there was enough of a line for all the strakes from the marks on frames 2 and 6. With these problems, I took a break from the hull to work on the rudder blade. The design provides for the blade to be weighted so that it falls down when the uphole is released, but can pivot up if it hits an obstruction. I melted lead on our patio heater and filed the filling smooth with a rasp. However, having now sailed with it, I have removed it and used a standard rope downhaul system. It was very heavy, and there was a lot of strain on the stock when using half rudder to steer in the shallows. In keeping with the traditional appearance, I ordered at some cost the gunmetal rudder fittings specified. They look good, but only have to smell seawater to turn green. With the garboards beveled and joined, it was time to glue them in place. To hold them in place, I used a combination of screws and clamps. Blocks were screwed to the frames at the lower level, and the top could be screwed to the sole. Temporary screws were self-tapping plasterboard screws with stainless steel for ones to be left in place. As mentioned, each frame has to be beveled to allow the garboards and strakes to lie flat on the frame. I used a long, flexible lath to assess the angle, but due to the hardness caused by the epoxy, beveling was made more difficult. The 9mm ply has to do a lot of bending and twisting to fasten to the stem, but one-handed clamps made it less difficult. As you can only single-handedly work one side at a time, there is a risk of the hull being distorted, so I dry-fitted one side before gluing the other. Even then, the stem did twist to one side by a degree or two due to the inadequate bracing of the central jig panel, as mentioned earlier. This photo shows the fitted garboards at the transom, with the overlap to be trimmed once all the strakes are on. The top edge will be planed to lie flat with the sole. Moving on to the next strake, a big problem arose. With the strake lined up on the pinholes on the front 2 formers and reaching the beveled 22mm line on the garboard, there was a considerable gap between the strake and those frames. Whilst the bevel was not perfect, to get the strake to rest on the frame would have meant cutting deep into the garboard and losing much of the clinker appearance. As the 30cm long gain to be cut is further forward, that wasn't the cause of the problem. I raised the issue on the Wooden Boats forum, and various suggestions were put forward. Clinton Chase of Chase Small Craft said that where it didn't lie on the frame, I could later fill any gap with epoxy paste filler. This drawing shows what would have had to have been done to get the strake to lie on the frame. To compound the problem, the strake is the one with the most twist and bend, as these photos show. Eventually I was able to get a reasonable lie, although pulling in the strake to the stem posed difficulties, only overcome with some bolts threaded through the helpful overlap and gradually tightened to fit. Again, with only one side glued at a time, the opposing side was dry fitted to provide support. From the next 3 photos you can see how the strake finished up with the temporary screws and penny washers still in place, the gains at the front, and a view inside showing the gap that was later filled and filleted. This shows both third strakes in place. You can see the traditional jamming clamps I made to hold each strake to the preceding one, and these worked well to reduce the number of holes drilled and blocks fitted to the frames. The build was now at March 2022, and a new arrival slowed work down. His name is Bran, a Basenji, a breed originating in the Congo and the oldest domesticated dog, proved by DNA research, although I think we have ended up with the least domesticated example. Nevertheless, both number 4 strakes went on with less difficulty, as both 3 and 4 have minimal twist to the vertical line of the stem. And then the final strake with the hull outside in spring sunshine. A large chunk of sapele was purchased for the one-piece skeg. I was then faced with laminating the false stem to be glued in front of the stem fitted at the start. Francois specified 3mm laminations, but I had to settle for 6mm as the timber merchant could only strip the Douglas fir down to that. To save making a steam box, I used a method I found on YouTube. A strip is soaked overnight, then wrapped in cloth, boiling water poured over it, wrapped in kitchen foil, and then ironed for 15 minutes or so. The build sequence is for the inner stem to be used as a former before the hull is begun, but as I couldn't get the wood in time, I had traced the shape and made a former to match. Here you can see a softened strip clamped to the former. I did one at a time and left them overnight to dry, but I could have done, say, 3 together to save time. With all 5 done, they went back onto the former to be glued. Bran took a keen interest in inspecting the completed item as a potential chewing stick. After tidying it up, it could be glued and screwed to the hull, and then further shaped. With the depth of the complete stem, I had difficulty in sourcing a suitably long U-bolt for the bow. The design was for a slot to be cut in the false stem, but I thought that this would be a weak point, so went for a U-bolt instead. I had also started work on the mast. I had in store the pine boom off Tiger Lily, my Golden Hind 31, a 10-metre cruising yacht, which the first owner had used to cruise the Irish Sea and us the English Channel, and I thought that it would be more than adequate for a 5-metre dinghy. The boat is now in the Netherlands with our son Alex with an alloy boom. Although it was shorter than specified, I thought a reduced sail area would suit me in old age. To square it off, I had to glue a strip down one side. The hull could now be finished off. The sole and garboard were double sheathed with glass cloth, and the skeg sole joint filleted. The dark patches are a fairing filler. Then the 2-pack primer went on, followed by the first of 2 coats of the 2-pack top coat. With hindsight, I think a 1-pack finish would have been better. The 2-pack was difficult to get a good finish, and ideally should be sprayed on, and mixing small amounts for any future scratch repair will be difficult. Brass keel bands were added to the stem, centerline, sole edges and skeg, and she was ready to turn over by mid-November 2022. With the help of 5 friends, the hull was rolled over onto the lawn. I didn't think we would be able to lift it off its jig, as there was a strong possibility that some epoxy glue had missed the packing tape that protected it. This proved to be so, and a little bit of effort was later needed to free everything from the inside of the hull. The cradle was first removed, and the hull was then lifted onto this and moved back into the garage. It's often said that the major part of building a boat is when you start to fit out a bare hull, but I had a target to finish in time for the Semaine de Golf starting in late May 2023, so no time to waste. This shows a dry fit of the rear bin sides, the side buoyancy tanks and the foredeck. This latter part came in 2 halves for more economic cutting from the ply sheet, but meant it had to be joined with reinforcing pieces underneath. The tanks are now glued in after internal epoxying, filleting and painting, as well as the rear and front compartments. In this photo can be seen the sub-frames lying on the tank, to which when fitted a rail is screwed to support the 2 cross benches. The mast hole has a reinforcing surround, trial fitted with an extension to the stem for a mooring cleat. On the tank side is a rail with slots for the rowing foot rests. The boat should be double rowed, but I only wanted one, so omitted the rear rail. Floor panel cross supports are also in place, and 2 of the gunnels are being pre-bent. This is the underside of the foredeck with the reinforcing pieces. The foredeck is now fitted. The outer gunnel is rebaited to fit over the end ply of the top strake. This gunnel was rebaited for me by Robbins of Bristol, who supplied the Douglas fir for the gunnels, boom, yard and oars, and the ply for the floorboards. The gunnel is made up of the outer part, a second inner full-length part, a third shorter mid-part, and a thinner bow length. The mast support has now been shaped and fitted, and the sub-frames glued and screwed in place. They were screwed from the outside, as I intended giving the top strake a further coat, and thus could fill and fair the screw holes so that they would not show. On time, the sail from R&J Sails, Clevedon, was ready. I wanted clipper canvas cloth for a traditional appearance, and Dick Hannaford made a beautiful job of it, complete with the Minahouet insignia and sail number. With a shorter mast, the sail is reduced accordingly, with just 2 reef lines, and is probably more than enough for my advancing age. I'd also ordered a boat cover from Trident with tie-down grommets to fasten onto hooks on the top strakes. And now 1-year-old Bran was still keen to keep an eye on the build. I'd not wanted the slatted floor as designed, but instead went for ply boards, 1 piece up front, 2 mid-boards, 1 at the rear, and a quick removal one just behind the centreboard case for bailing out. In this photo you can see the finished tiller, the centreboard top with the rear bench support, the mast chock, and the oar blocks. The floorboards have turnbuckle holes with a second hole for lifting. The boards mainly rest on cross beams and the hull, but with pillars to which the turnbuckles are attached. This shows the system on the rear board. A threaded insert is fitted to a base glued down on top of the pillar, and a bolt and washer attaches the turnbuckle to the base. The inner rails have now been fitted to the sub-frames with a trial fit of the benches. The rail is quite beefy, and I was concerned about the amount it had to bend, especially at the bow where it reaches the forward frame. Perhaps I should have made a steam box after all. However, I'd seen another builder with a grooved rail, and by doing this with a router, I found the rail bent more easily to be screwed and glued to the subframes. I was uncertain about the designed rear deck and side benches. The rear appeared to be slatted, with the compartment below filled with foam blocks. There were limber holes in the rear frame which I had blocked up, and I cut an access hatch as shown. Was there a panel to go underneath the slats, as otherwise water would get below? Without foam blocks it would not be a buoyancy tank. From experience I have an aversion to sealing off any areas of a boat preventing access, hence no foam. So I made the rear decking up of planks glued together. The extended side planks go via the top of the rear frame to the rear cross bench and have to rise to that level, also having to rest on the side rail, presenting another difficulty in bending wood over a short distance. After much effort, this was finally achieved. It is now the end of March, and for my birthday, my daughter Gemma drew a birthday card showing me sailing the finished boat. The side tanks now have edging mouldings added to cover end ply, and considerable time was spent filleting and sanding the interior. Then epoxy coating, painting and completing the rear deck and cross benches. The mast, boom and yard were tapered and rounded off as best I could. I was reassured by Francois's comment to not worry about getting a perfect finish for something which has the style of a working boat. I was able to persuade Jenny, my wife, to learn the skill of leather working, and she produced perfect examples for the mast ring and the mast, boom and yard protectors. Here's the rudder stock with gudgeons attached to enable me to set up the pintles on the transom. Almost there. Another of my dislikes is varnish. I've had varnished gunnels on other boats, and Tiger Lily's boom was originally varnished. One bump and water gets in, and to maintain a presentable finish means a complete rub down and re-varnishing. Tiger Lily's gunnels came painted with Sickens stain and top coat, and any abrasions only need touching up. So all the bare wood on the dinghy has been stained and then finished with Sickens. The floorboards were epoxy coated, with the top given a non-skid finish, fine textured masonry paint. Early May saw us outside on the cradle, ready for lifting onto the road trailer, and then fully loaded for travelling to France to take part in the Semaine de Golf. Here we are being launched at Port Anna in the Gulf of Morbihan with a traditional champagne ceremony aided by our good friend and fellow Minahouet builder Alain. A nice atmospheric photo of us sailing in the Gulf, unfortunately with the photographer failing to include the top of the mast. Later that year saw us sailing in Poole Harbour out of our home club Parkston Yacht Club, and then in early October a day sail in Cardiff Bay. 2024 was a quiet year with more sailing in Poole Harbour and then a week in France taking part in the Rendezvous de l'Erdre, a music and sailing festival sailing down the Erdre River into Nantes. 2025 was again the Semaine du Golfe in June, and then a return to the Erdre, and finally a late week in the Gulf for the Maison Bleue, where we landed on one of the many islands, Elure, with Bran. And that's the end. Many thanks for watching, and please let me know if you have any queries on the build, and you can also take a look at my Instagram blog, Howell Stop B, which has more information. Thank you very much again. Bye bye.